What up, Wizards? It's Dev. Mtg, we like it at Magic, and I got a pretty important one for you today because during spoiler season, any jackhole can sit here on my couch like a fat man and talk about what card's going to be good, what card's going to be bad, and this card's trash, and this card's awesome, and all that. And I do. Believe me, it's probably the majority of what we do here on the channel. It's what we get the most views for. But in any case, then what happens when the set comes out? Whoops, right? There's a bunch of cards that come out of nowhere that we never saw coming. Or maybe we didn't think are going to be as good as they are. And then there's a bunch of cards we thought were going to be amazing in every deck, and they just never show up to anything. And of course, there's also cards that are exactly what we thought they were. So now that we've had a week to play with this set, and we have had a few tournaments, I've scoured what limited tournament results we have had, to determine what cards from Innistrad Midnight Hunt are actually seeing standard play. And I know it's just week one, but week one matters a good bit. A lot of what happens in week one establishes this sort of snowball effect for the rest of the season. And even though cards might show up in week one and then get cut in later weeks, I still think it's important to look at what results we do have and see what cards are recurring the most often. So today, let's look at the top 10 cards from Innistrad Midnight Hunt that are seeing some standard play right now.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck techs. I come correct like a porn star, slicing up all these other suckers with my sword mark.
Good tunes. Hey, by the way, make sure you like and subscribe. You don't have to, but it would mean an awful lot to me if you did. I'm trying to get to 150k subscribers, and it's going to take a lot of subs to do that. So help me out. You can also watch me play Magic over here. We're going to be doing that this weekend. Or if you want to, you can donate $1 every month to the channel. That'll let you vote on content. There should be a Patreon poll up right now, actually, as I release this video. So go check that out. But anyway, self-promotion over. Let's go ahead and get to the content. I know how much you love that content. So let's talk about that real quick, starting with some honorable mentions, because, I have to do that. But the first thing, I've got 3 of them in this video, and I'm not going to talk about them too long because these were all cards that I saw in decks in tournament results. And by the way, I just want to clear this up because I didn't say it a second ago. All the decks that I looked at for this video are all decks that had winning records in the tournaments they participated in. So I didn't look at anything that was like 0-3 and was like, oh, this card's seen a lot of plays. And you can't see him playing bad decks. So I only looked at decks with winning records to kind of make this video. But one card that I did see, and at least one Is It Dragons list with a winning record, was Smouldering Egg, which was actually my #1 sleeper, but that's not the whole reason why I wanted to bring it up in this video. I didn't see a whole lot of Is It Dragons lists on this card, only the one, but again, did have a quite a good record if I remember correctly. And it was playing 3 copies of Egg. And honestly, I'm not sure you have to play that many moving forward, but it wouldn't surprise me if we saw a lot of Is It Dragons decks experimenting with at least a 1 of Smouldering Egg. Works really well with Arlen's Epiphany because Epiphany basically flips it, and then you have a free turn with all your mana and a gutter snipe that flies over for 4 damage. So just a really powerful looking card in those decks. But I've played a few games of Smouldering Egg, and it didn't impress me as much as I thought it would at one point, but I was still happy to see it show up in at least one list. But the other honorable mentions that I have, I should go ahead and talk about Root Coil. I always mess it up. Root Coil Creeper. I really like this card a good bit, and I haven't talked about it much in the sort of preseason or during spoiler season or any of my lists or anything, but I do think this is actually a really, really sweet card, and I saw this show up in at least one list as well. So I like this a good bit, and I'd like to see it in some more lists, but right now, even though there are some Sultai mid-range and even Simic mid-range decks that are making, somewhat of a splash, and I believe the deck that I saw this in was a Simic mid-range deck with a winning record. The card just really doesn't show up super often because its color combination isn't super well represented in Standard at the moment. But moving forward, it very well may be. And if we see more blue-green or blue-green X decks that need, turn 2 mana ramp, I think that they might look towards this card a lot more often, especially if they do run cards like Storm the Festival and other important flashback cards. So big fan of this, and I've seen it show up at least once, and I wouldn't be surprised to see it show up more often. But the third honorable mention is Memory Deluge. I've only seen this in one blue-black control deck, but again, as the format rolls on, I wouldn't be surprised to see more of this card. As we see control decks develop, it usually takes, 2 weeks to a month for control decks to really figure out the meta, for the meta to, coalesce into the kind of form where a control deck can then solve it. So we don't see a whole lot of super successful control decks in the first few weeks of formats traditionally in Standard. But as, again, these control decks start to take form and congeal a little bit more, then it wouldn't surprise me if we saw more Memory Deluge in results. But let's move on to the list here, which includes cards that have actually recurred in multiple decks with winning records so far in what tournaments we have access to. Now, number 10, with all that in mind, is Lisa. Of all cards, I'm kind of surprised, to be honest. I do like this card a good bit, but I wasn't sure it was going to immediately make a splash in Standard, much less week 1 or anything. So this has shown up in a couple of Orzhov Angels lists that have done fairly well in tournaments, and it's even shown up in a list or two outside of that. It's been in a Blood on the Snow sort of Orzhov mid-range list. So this is showing up in a couple of different decks that can make black and white, but mostly I see this in the Angels deck as a replacement, but in most cases not all the way. You'll see like a 2-2 split between this and Rampage of the Valkyries. But I do like the way this handles a base statted Goldspan Dragon, which is an important thing to be able to do in this Standard. By the way, another story here is that now that Lisa's around, apparently Orzhov Angels is an actual playable deck. We first saw Orzhov Angels start to rise to prominence in 2022 Standard, and it maintained a bit of a foothold for a while, but it was never a very popular or heavily played deck. But now in the first week of Standard, we see multiple Orzhov Angels decks with winning record in multiple tournaments. So that's probably a good sign for the deck. And even though I think there's probably better ways to play mid-range in this format, Orzhov Angels is still looking pretty dangerous at the moment, at least. And Lisa's a big part of that. Number 9 is Spectral Adversary. Now, this is seeing play every now and again in Is It Dragons list. People are trying out a bunch of new cards in those decks. And I have seen some copies, in one case 4 copies, of Spectral Adversary in Is It Dragons so far this season. But what small number of modern tournaments we have access to, I believe it's 2 at this point, this has made it into a couple of Modern Spirits decks that I've seen. So whether they had winning records or not. So I at least want to point out this card is seeing some small amount of modern play, but it's also seen play in Standard and, from what I understand, Historic. So I haven't looked into it much, but people are telling me it's seeing a lot of Historic play. But just for its Standard play, which is what this list is based on, I had to put it on the list because I've seen it in, again, multiple Is It Dragons decks, and it does look like a pretty good tool there. Now, number 8 is Fateful Absence. Now, Infernal Grasp and the red removal spell Cathartic Pyre, I believe. Now, these have shown up in decks too, but not anywhere near as often as Fateful Absence, so I wanted to give this card the nod. This is another reason Orzhov Angels is coming up. A lot of these Orzhov Angels lists have 4 copies of Vanishing Verse and 4 copies of Fateful Absence, so they can take out pretty much anything on the whole freaking table for relatively cheap and at instant speed. So this card has been a great addition not only to Orzhov Angels, but to multiple other deck lists that play white and they're looking for premier removal. White was missing a removal piece like this, so just the fact that this card exists has made white more playable in a number of avenues, and I've seen this card in plenty of deck lists. That said, even though I've probably seen this card in more deck lists than almost any other card on the list, I will say that it's not quite as high impact as some of the other cards on the list, even if those have seen a little bit less play altogether. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just a removal spell, but it is a very, very good removal spell that has elevated certain decks. Number 7 is Moonveil Regent. I'm not sure, though, I'm going to throw this out there, that this card is going to continue seeing a ton of play. But one thing I've noted about Regent is how many different kinds of decks it shows up in. I've seen this in a Gruul deck. I've seen this in a Boros aggro deck with a really good record at Hooglandia, if I remember correctly. And I've seen it other places too. I've seen it in Red Blue Dragons. I've seen it as a 1 or 2 of in different sideboards. So the card is kind of showing up, not necessarily everywhere, but again, in a very diverse number of decks, from like aggro to the Is It Dragons decks to a couple of other things. And again, it even sees sideboard play. So I was a little nervous that Moonveil Regent would not see the amount of play that I wanted it to. But right now, it seems to be riding a pretty good line of playability where it's not the most important card in the format or anything, but it is an important role player in a ton of decks. Again, in that Boros aggro deck, this is probably the best possible card drawing engine you could play in that deck. In the Gruul deck, it's a great 4-drop, but it does compete with other stuff like Esika's Chariot and whatnot. So even the decks, again, even the decks like Gruul that play great 4-drops like Chariot, Arlen, whatever, still often find room for a 2 of this card. And that says a lot about Regent. So I guess I'm happy that it's seeing the amount of play that it is, because I was really afraid this would not be. as good a card as I wanted it to be. But so far, at least, again, I'm still, if you can't tell, I'm still antsy and worried that it's going to start getting cut here and there. But so far, at least, the card has showed up quite a bit. On the flip side, though, the card might be even better and start going into more lists than I thought, right? So the card may have truly not even shown its butt yet. Did you get that? It's a joke about mooning. I don't even know if that's a thing people say in other parts of the country. In the South, it's a colloquialism where if somebody like messes up or, you know, makes a public spectacle, we say, oh, he really showed his butt, but we don't say it in such YouTube monetization friendly terms, right? So I don't even know if people are going to get that turn of phrase. But anyway, the next card I want to talk about is a card I just mentioned, and that's Arlen. Now, an interesting thing about this card is that it shows up in the occasional werewolves list, and yeah, werewolves have been seeing some play. As a matter of fact, I think werewolves are one of the most played decks in the early days of this format, which is reassuring, because again, werewolves I wasn't sure was going to be very good. And I still think mono green might be the better deck, and maybe we're just waiting on people to like realize that, but I'm not sure. I have played with a bunch of werewolf decks, trying to draft one up for a deck tech, and it has been somewhat impressive. However, the best werewolf builds I've come up with have played relatively few, and in some cases, one case, 0 copies of this card. As a matter of fact, one of the most winning werewolves decks that I looked at was exactly the same, 0 copies of Arlen. So again, she is in some werewolves decks, but she's not in all the werewolves decks, which I thought was interesting. That said, she is in a Gruul Bard class deck that showed up with a winning record to the Hooglandia Open. She is in a Naya pile. It's kind of a Naya mid-range deck that I've seen going around with a winning record too, at I believe a league standard tournament with 20 players. So again, a very low sample size of that tournament, but still showed up at that tournament. So I'm surprised at the number of decks this is showing up in that are not werewolves decks. It's a lot of decks I would assume would just play Essica's Chariot. But often you'll see a split between the two cards or something, or you'll see the 4 Essica's Chariot, like a 1 or 2 of Arlen's. So this card is showing up in a bunch of decks that are specifically not werewolves decks. And I thought that was a really interesting thing about the card, but it is still showing up in the odd werewolves deck here or there. And I honestly believe more often than not it is in the werewolves decks. So, but again, I think it's worth noting that the best werewolf deck that we've seen so far in terms of overall record did not play any Arlen. Just keep that in the back of your head. So this card might start getting cut from werewolves decks, but still appears to have a home in other decks. So I'm just really interested to see Arlen kind of getting shopped around the way she is. I didn't see that coming. But of course, Arlen is darlin', but a werewolf that's seeing a ton of play, again, just like Arlen, outside of werewolves decks, is Brutal Cathar. You know, this is a card that I was just sure Skyclave Apparition was better than, and it is. On a lot of levels, Skyclave Apparition is just better than this card, but you'll often see Skyclave Apparition in the mono-white decks. And there's kind of been a marked absence of mono-white decks so far in this format, which really surprises me. But, you know, once we get to some of the more mid-range options, especially some of the stuff we'll talk about a little bit later in the video, you'll kind of see why mono-white aggro's been a little outclassed at this point. There's just things they can't play through. But there are Boros decks, Boros aggro decks. There are Naya decks, including a Naya werewolves deck, by the way, that had a 3-2 record, which is still a winning record, if I remember correctly. Again, a lot of this is going to be if I remember correctly. But like I said, everything I looked at was winning records. But Brutal Cathar has shown up in main decks. It's shown up in a Naya mid-range deck that wasn't a werewolves deck as a 4-of. It's shown up in a Boros aggro deck as a 4-of. It's shown up in multiple sideboards as at the very least a 2-of when I've seen it. So again, this card's seeing sort of a wide spread of play. And I don't think any of it is for the backside of the card, even though like the backside is somewhat important some of the time, I'm sure. But I think a big reason this card is seeing the play that it is right now is because unlike Skyclave Apparition, this can be put in 3-color decks, which is mostly what I've seen it in. But even in like the Boros aggro deck that I've seen it as a 4-of in, it's still a better choice than Skyclave a lot of the time because it's a lot more consistent. You can more easily cast it on turn 3. So at this point, it's more like if the deck is more than just mono white, if it's a 2 or 3 color deck, often it seems like players are opting to play Brutal Cathar rather than Skyclave Apparition. So I wanted to point that out. This card is seeing a good amount of play, like way more than I would have assumed. And I think a lot of it is contributed to the mana cost. Number 4, all the way up here, is Briarbridge Tracker. We all made fun of this card during spoiler season, myself included, while still on some level, acknowledging that the card looked okay, right? Like this was tired tracker, all those hilarious jokes and all that. Because it's just not as good as a tireless tracker, and it still isn't, but it's a phenomenal card, it turns out. There's a lot of cool things about this. The vigilance, I just want to throw this out. The vigilance is so much more important than you might think. The token that it makes, yeah, it's a clue. It's just going to draw you one card. I think we were all spoiled on Tireless Tracker. We didn't realize that drawing a card is good. Being able to draw a card is fantastic. This works really well with the Seeker's Chariot for a couple of reasons. You play a Chariot, you can crack your clue, and you still have tokens out, so this thing is still big. Aside from that, when you crew your Chariot and attack with it, you can copy the clue token and just draw more cards. So that's sometimes important. This works super well with the Seeker's Chariot, and it works really well considering that they are on curve with one another. A lot of the mono green deck, I've been surprised by this. A lot of the mono green decks will play some number of this and have cut Old Growth Troll again in some number. You'll even see some decks play all 4 Old Growth Troll and then some number of this card because it's just so phenomenal. I mean, a keyword ability on a 3-mana 4-power creature is already somewhat playable, right? But then you also get a card, and getting a card is ridiculously good, it turns out. So, Old Growth Troll, if it dies, it'll come back at least the one time. Kazandu Mammoth doesn't really have a whole lot of value stapled to it. Primal Adversary has some value stapled to it, yes, and I think it's a very, very good card. But ultimately, if you play this card and your opponent kills it, you still got some value, and that's not true of every green 3-drop. So it's seeing a lot of play over cards like Kazandu Mammoth that we're seeing play in that slot. So just take note of this. It's in the mono green decks amazingly. It's in the Gruul decks. It's in some Naya builds. It's in some Sultai builds that I've seen. So again, huge spread of playability on this card in pretty much any deck that needs a well-statted creature and also wants to draw cards, which is just about every deck right now, wants to play this card so long as they can make green mana. Now for number 3, I'm going to cheat just a little bit and just say werewolves. I've already brought up that werewolves have been a really popular deck and a fairly winning deck so far in the early days of this standard. But I was surprised by just how popular and good this deck was. And moreover, and I think what really gives them this slot here in the top 3 is the werewolves that are seeing play, right? Because Tovolar is seeing some play. And Tovolar's in most werewolves decks, but just like Arlen, Tovolar is not actually in every single werewolves deck. It sounds nuts, but again, the winningest werewolves list we've seen did not play main deck Tovolar, which is just mind-blowing, but most decks do. It's the other werewolves that I'm sort of most interested in, For instance, Reckless Stormseeker. Ton of play. It's a 4 of in all the werewolves decks right now, and it's seeing play in other decks outside of that. Again, decks that just want to go fast and have access to red, Boros aggro, or whatever. Will often find room for this card, especially once it flips over. It's a beast. Number 2 is Storm the Festival. A card's got a bunch of werewolves on it, but it's not really about werewolves for once on this list. This card has just been phenomenal so far and has shown up in Sultai builds and I guess more importantly, to this early date, Selesnya builds. Selesnya has been slamming this card so far in the first week to great results, not only in the League Standard events that I looked at, but in the Hooglandia Open, this is the winningest deck. And in a Magic for Old Guys tournament, which only had like 6 entrants, this was the number 1 deck at that tournament. So, even in small scale tournaments, this deck is rearing its head. So I'm just as surprised as anybody else. I did not see Selesnya of all things coming, but it's not just Selesnya. Again, Sultai and Golgari even are very popular choices for Storm the Festival. The Golgari deck can put in Binding the Old Gods and Lolth and stuff, and those are important planeswalkers too. They can just slam really good cards with Storm the Festival. And the flashback has been incredibly important on this card in multiple situations, just from a player's perspective, what I've played with this card. And I've got a bunch of different decks with this card right now because I was excited about it. When I've played with this card, the flashback has been incredibly relevant, way more than I thought it was going to be. Casting this card once in a game is often backbreaking enough, but casting it twice is stupid. I don't know why the card has flashback, but it's incredibly relevant, like all the time, at least in anecdotal experiences on my part. But anyway, the card is really seeing a ton of play, and whether or not that changes, maybe when control decks hit the format or more decks with counter spells start seeing play. A card like this might, be downgraded in importance, but like Emergent Ultimatum ruled Standard for the last few months that it was available to play after it really filled out when Kaldheim came out. And this card could be not necessarily Emergent Ultimatum. It could be Genesis Ultimatum. It's entirely possible this is just the new Genesis Ultimatum. And almost no matter what it gets you two incredible things almost every time. So just a great card so far in this Standard that, again, could get cut here and there, but is really starting to look like one of the format's premier build-arounds, like a la Fires of Invention or Genesis Ultimatum. So I just wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing more optimized lists with this card really take over the format, at least in the coming weeks. Just easily the best build-around, probably, from the set. Unless you want to count my number one as a build-around, but I don't think my number one is a build-around. I think it's just a card that produces an incredible amount of value and goes on curve well with some pretty heavily played cards. So you may have already guessed this, but my number one is RenSeven. Card's stupid. Like, the card is probably the most powerful Planeswalker in Standard, and I'm not actually sure that it's close. There are some other great Planeswalkers, don't get me wrong. Lolth, again, comes to mind, but I'm still pretty sure that RenSeven is the most powerful Walker in Standard by some mileage, because look at everything this does. I mean, you can read the card and tell that it's going to be great, but some of the play patterns available with the card are just so undeniably powerful that it'll just completely steamroll anybody you can actually pull off the sequence against. Obviously, Esika's Chariot into RenSeven, make a token, crew the chariot, attack, copy the token is very dumb. But just RenSeven by itself, without having to curve anything into it, is good enough. It turns out super good. And even the zero mode has been good on this card in that Selesnya deck that's been seeing some play. A lot of people are playing Scoot Swarm. Well, if you get a bunch of lands in your hand and you have a Scoot Swarm on the table, and you drop 3 lands onto the table all at one time, that's a bunch of Scoots. That's so many Scoots, and that has mattered from what I can tell in a bunch of decks because they elect to play Scoot Swarm alongside this card, giving the zero mode something to do. The 1 is even good because, again, just like we talked about Storm the Festival, a lot of times you'll see RenSeven in Storm the Festival decks and vice versa. If Storm the Festival deck, RenSeven goes in. It's just the best 5-drop you can get off of a Storm, right? So this, when you play it on turn 5 or when you have 5 mana, you +1 it and it helps you get that 6th mana to make sure you can play Storm on the next turn. So that's an important play sequence too. There's just too many sequences and important play lines that this sort of works its way into in Standard right now. And even though it's just the first week, I'm pretty confident in saying that at least in terms of Standard playability, not talking about Modern, Historic, Legacy, or Commander, and I think Commander really does a lot to, play into the playability of certain cards. So just all of that by the wayside, Standard only, I think I can pretty confidently say that RenSeven is not only the most powerful card from the set in week 1, but will continue to be so as time rolls on in Standard. But that's it for this one. Just let me know how you feel about everything down there. And of course, subscribe. I'm trying to get to 150k subs, which means we need 28,000 subs. So I've set a high bar, but they say that's what you're supposed to do. Just sub, even if you're not usually one to sub to YouTube channels. It would mean a lot to me, trust me. But aside from that, you can throw $1 in the Patreon pot every month, and that'll let you vote on content. There's a Patreon poll right now. And we're going to be playing Magic on Twitch this weekend, so check me out there. Aside from that, I just want to take the end of this video to thank everyone for their encouraging words on Twitter over the last few days. In case you don't know, I have a dog. A lot of people just don't even know that. They think I'm just a cat guy, and because I have cats, I hate dogs. No, I love dogs. I'm an animal person. I love animals. And a few days ago, the dog took ill. He lost of appetite, lethargic, breathing problems and stuff. So we took him to a vet who recommended us to an emergency vet in Atlanta. And I hadn't even told people on Twitter this yet. My wife did. Brittany did. But in case you don't follow her, we have gotten the proper diagnosis back on the dog. It's not any of the horrible stuff that we thought it was, but it's still not great. The dog has congestive heart failure. And he's not even 2 years old. Not even 2 years old. It is congenital. He was bred with this disease, basically. But even though it sounds terrible, with proper medication, he's going to have to take like 4 pills every day for the rest of his life. But with proper medication, we've been told that he could live a normal lifespan, which would be fantastic. He may also require surgery, which is going to be expensive. They're going to like put a balloon in his stomach. I've never heard of this before, but they may have to do that. We have to monitor him for a couple of weeks. But that said, his mood is already improved. His energy level is already improved a little bit. He's back home. He's doing okay for now. So if you offered kindness or encouraging words over Twitter in the last few days, I just want to say, thank you very much. It would have been much harder without all of you. Seriously, it really meant a lot to me. And B, the dog's not out of the woods yet, but the dog is, it's better than we thought. It's better than we initially thought. We thought the dog had a ruptured diaphragm at first, which is going to be really complicated. We then thought the dog may have had a form of cancer, and then he didn't, so that's good. So congestive heart failure is bad, but it's not as bad as we may have thought, and the dog, again, could live his normal lifespan. I apologize, now that I think about it, to anybody that's having health problems with their pets or with people in their lives or themselves. Should have maybe done a content warning or something like that, because this is pretty heavy business, but I just want to let you know that it really did mean a lot to me, and Brittany for that matter. All of your kindness on Twitter over the last few days. It's why I haven't been here, in case you want to know. We did the Meat Hook Massacre Deck Tech on Sunday, and I basically maintained radio silence since then, and this is why. I've had some of the most emotional days of my life in the last few days. Not ashamed to admit that I've cried a lot in the last few days. And again, through that sort of pain. A lot of you did a lot to lift my spirits. So thank you. It meant more than you can possibly know. But serious part's over. I don't know how to end this on a happy note after that. But I guess the dog could very well be completely fine and live a great life. And I'm going to love him every moment that I possibly can from here on out and never take him for granted ever again. I don't think I was doing that before, but I'm going to hug him even more now. But anyway, I love you guys. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you appreciated the video. Let me know how you felt about it down there. And I will catch you cats later. I am Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.